at the very dawn of time, the formation of the Milky Way galaxy, the die was cast. For reality was created in two forms, one of substance, form and logic, and one of thought, dreams and emotions. The material universe, what we perceive as reality, was later to be called the materium. The well of souls, the astral, the spiritual plane, was later to be called the immaterium. Some say that the realms were always contiguous but separate. Some say that they were once one, and that all reality was much simpler then. For the materium and immaterium were mostly unpopulated, were blank canvases to be drawn on by the beings that were always meant to arise. But as I have said, there was a hidden darkness that lurked amidst the dazzling splendor of that new dawn, beings that should not have existed. But we shall get to them later. And so, as is always the way, for nature abhors a vacuum, two great races arose amongst the brilliant and innocent days of those early ages of the galaxy. Polar opposites, one might say. One race was the Old Ones. Some say they were mighty saurians, reptiles. Some say they were a confederation of like-minded souls. But we may never know the truth. All that is known is that the Old Ones were forces of light. From their earliest days they were careful and cautious, and swore oaths that by their action or repercussion from their actions they would do no harm. And they were not hasty, though driven, for they explored inner space before looking out to the universe as a whole. They worked slowly and methodically, and accrued great wisdom, and developed patience, compassion, and a love for all that lives and grows. They learnt the keys to the universe that they most explored, the realms of thought and feelings, spirituality and balance. And they became masters of the immaterium, and would wield it like a mighty tool without compare. And none have ever approached their magnificence, their might, their splendor, in all of the races and ages that have come thereafter. For they acted with a measured hand and forethought at all times. And they conquered the demons within, of jealousy and anger and spite, and made them things of the past within their collective. And once this had been done, they then discerned how best to traverse the galaxy. They created a great webway of gates and corridors within the immaterium, a sub-realm, such that they could walk from one world to another in the blink of an eye, could move vast shoals of their vessels to any point in the galaxy without repercussion or delay. For they cared for the worlds, both materium and immaterium. Despite them being masters of the one, they knew the import and gave honor to both. And they set out into the galaxy and spread their word, their wisdom, their bounty. For their studies had brought upon them a state of being that was so aligned to the universe, so natural, so profound and sublime, that death and disease touched them not. They were beings of light and akin to cosmic gardeners, for where'er they went, they encouraged and cultivated life, and brought many a race to early sentience. Their knowledge of themselves gave them the skill to alter beings on a genetic level, to raise them up, to enhance them, and to then, when grown into the full bloom of consciousness, they would teach them, and they would guard them. And thus the Old Ones bestrode the galaxy, and their presence was felt across its myriad stars. Their beauty made a thing for all but one. But if there is light, then there is always darkness in equal measure. And so a race arose to create the cosmic balance, the necrontier. The necrontier were cursed from their first breaths. Their world orbited a broken sun a cursed sun, an unstable sun. And the rays that came from it were not, as with other suns, the gift from the heavens, the reason for all life, heat and warmth. No, for their sun's rays were like a constant assault on the bodies and beings of the planet, shredding them, burning them, mutating them, making the existence of the necrontier one of constant, never-ending pain, of short lifespan and misery. And the effect went on to create a twisting in the souls of the necrontier, for their lives were short and so racked with agony that all was constant struggle, constant rage. They fought against each other, against anything else that arose around them. They fought against their short lifespans by developing an insane urge to be remembered, to be lauded, to not be forgot. For if one has so short a time to exist, one can only gain immortality via the actions one performs in the brief span allotted. And warlords came and went, drove their race onwards until they came to master the physical world, their technology being the dominion of the materium. And they tried to escape the harsh sun that had leered down at them and cursed their flesh. But it was not to be. For even when they created vast stasis ships, and their population slept as they moved slowly through the cold void of space to new worlds to conquer and colonize, even when they made landfall, culled all that were previously resident, even when they had spent generation after generation on the new worlds, away from the original blighting sun, still their people did not heal. They could never escape the taint foisted on them, as it was now writ into their DNA, their very existence. And this discovery, that they would never ever be free of the pain of their existence, drove their people and their culture insane. The bitterness it created turned to rage, and as they spread throughout the galaxy, they did it the hard way. Long were their ships in transit, and slow was their expansion into the spaces between them and the old ones. As they reached each new world, they no longer culled all life out of expedience or over territory or resources. They killed all out of jealousy and spite. They became a slowly expanding dark cloud across the galaxy, one that ate all it came into contact with. And inevitably, inexorably, the Old Ones and the necrontier were to meet. And both recoiled in utter shock. For the necrontier, it was the answer to their prayers, all of their goals in one. They met a race with the knowledge and power to free them of their curse, to alter their genes, their DNA, to remove their pain, and to then go on to grant them immortality. Their one most cherished desire, to live. They hungered for these ways, possibly more than any race has hungered for anything since. For the Old Ones' part, they were repulsed. Utterly. For they saw the darkness in the necrontier, and knew it was no longer just that of form, of the materium. For they had never looked within, they had never come to the answers that the Old Ones had, because the necrontier were not wise. They were not patient. They were not compassionate. They were not beings of light. They were beings of darkness. And it is said that the Old Ones saw that the twisting of their forms had led to the twisting of their souls. Where the Old Ones were cultivators, the necrontier were destroyers. Where the Old Ones brought up races and beings, the necrontier destroyed them or forced them into subjugation. The canker in their souls was now too deep, and it made them things of evil. And so, the Old Ones looked at the necrontier and weighed the balance of their action, as they always did. If they gave the necrontier their secrets, It may well cure them, may well improve them. But what if it did not? What if the damage to their psyches, their meagre souls, was not able to be healed? In this instance, if they would not change, then the old ones would have made these nightmares of hate and spite and murder into immortals, and their scourge would never be stopped. They could rule the galaxy in a reign of terror from that day forward until the days when the very stars burnt cold. And it was a risk that the old ones, in their wisdom, simply could not take. For it would not be they who paid the price. It would be every lesser race they had cultivated, raised and taught. It would be their children that paid the toll if this were an error. And thus, out of the love of life, out of the pity they had for the younger races, out of mercy towards the stars of the galaxy and every planet which revolved around them, they threw the necrontier's pleas back in their faces and denied them. Though there is so much more to tell of the inner struggle of the necrontier, the civil wars, etc., we must skirt these issues for brevity. And so, the necrontier declared war on the old ones. In the first stages of the war, the necrontier were defeated again and again. Their ships, forged into huge armadas, still moved slowly, and the old ones could use their arts, their webway, to appear in strength and crush the necrons. The old ones' powers of the immaterium were also something that the necrontier could not defeat, no matter how powerful their weapons of the immaterium were. And thus, the necrontier were forced back to the fringes of the galaxy, corralled and cut off and jailed within systems, and then left to rot. Or so the necrontier would have you believe, so the standard accepted wisdom states. But I believe that the old ones did this to prove that the knowledge of the materium that the necrontier so touted was always secondary to the knowledge of the immaterium, the wisdom of the soul. And thus I believe that the old ones gave them mercy when they could have eradicated them to the least and the last. They did this in the hopes that the necrontier would delve inwards, as they had no other option. They would look to heal themselves from within, instead of trying to dominate that which was without. But in this hope the old ones were utterly misguided. For they were beings of light, and could never understand or compromise the nature of hate and fear and evil. And so the necrontier looked at their son, with their ever-increasing knowledge of the materium, what we would call science, and they began to understand. For their son, their curse from birth, had been caused by another force, a dark and malevolent cadre of entities that existed in the world. One was above their son, consuming it. Beings that I mentioned at the very beginning, creatures of dark power that hailed from the very dawn of time. For these beings were made of energy, and although sentient, were not of what we call form, and it was one such being that had been slowly consuming their son, had been the cause of all their pain and suffering and the hate that resulted from it. For these beings would move through the coldest space and attach themselves to a sun, and over millions of years they would consume it. And such had been the fate of the son of the necrontier. Alas, the greatest opportunity was missed. For if the necrontier had not been driven mad by their suffering, then compounded by their envy of the old ones and their halcyon existence, then they may have seen that these beings, what they called their star gods, the Catan, would have been their natural enemy, the beings that had caused their fall. Alas, this was not to be. So eaten by hate with the necrontier that they did not blame the dark gods. They tried to contact them. And eventually, they did. And they unleashed a horror unfathomable to any sentient being upon the universe. For they contacted the dark gods of the immaterium, these Catan, and then used all of their scientific knowledge, bent every sinew of their minds and culture to forging receptacles for them. And in that instant, when they succeeded, when the first Catan was clothed in necrodermis, its sentience finally aware of the lesser beings that inhabited its realm, the materium, Pandora's box was opened. For they were demons of the materium, and their power, now directed, now awoken, now shown to them by the reckless necrontier, it was only matched by their hunger, and that was unquenchable. The Catan then taught the necrontier many things about the real world, about time, about energy. In so doing, they were never viewed as benevolent by the necrontier, but they were seen as powerful enough to take on the Old Ones. And thus the Catan promised all that the necrontier had been denied by the Old Ones. They promised freedom from pain, from mutation, from death. The Catan, in their twisted trickery, promised the necrontier immortality. And thus it was accepted with zeal. All the necrontier had to do was bend the knee and proclaim the Catan as their masters. If they did this, they would not only gain immortality and freedom from pain, but they would be given the power to exact vengeance on the Old Ones, to bring them low. And thus the necrontier accepted. And their entire populace was taken to vast facilities that stripped them of their flesh and placed their sentience in necrodermis, the living metal that would mean their existence was eternal. But they were betrayed. In the process of the transference, the transformation from living beings to metal monsters, they were stripped of their souls that were converted to energy, power to feed the Catan. And they knew it. As soon as they were converted, the necrontier knew something was missing. Their very souls. But it was too late. Their new masters were too powerful, and besides, they had been given exactly what they had wished for. So, as the saying goes, always be careful when you wish, for the devil is always in the detail. And so the undying soulless legions of the Necrons were born, with their dark demons of the materium to lead them, with their hordes and hosts now immortal and implacable. The second stage of the war in heaven began. And it is here that we see the most important events of the galaxy, for in those dark days the future course of the universe was set. For the Old Ones could not stand before the power of the Catan and Necrons combined. Long was the war fought, millions of years in the doing, many say. But eventually, the Old Ones were beaten again and again, and they saw the cost of their defeat. For where the Catan were not hurled back, carnage unprecedented levels was wrought. Entire planetary populations and star systems were either culled by the Necrons or consumed by their masters, the Catan. The Old Ones were losing. And with so much at stake, they took dire and drastic action. Seeing the forces of darkness crush and kill and destroy all that they had made, all that they had done, the Old Ones then weaponized the warp. They used their arcane abilities unfettered and met the Catan head-on, unleashing forces that should never have been unleashed. They went so far as to betray their own morals, some might say, by lowering themselves to changing more and more of the young races of the galaxy, to tinker with them, to alter them, to forge them into weapons of war. And many races began to develop psychic powers, psychic abilities, the power to alter and use the immaterium, as did the Old Ones. Thus were the Elder, Jaquero, others, and the Krork, now known by their devolved name of the Orcs. These beings were created by the Old Ones as entire warrior races designed to hold back and then destroy the Necrons and their masters. As the necrontier had opened the Pandora's box in their materium by clothing the Catan in forms, the Old Ones opened the door in the immaterium, and the galaxy has never been the same since. The immaterium, the realm of souls and spirits. It did not wish to be used thus. It fought back against its desecration, and dark beings began to form in that realm. Beings that would attack Psykers, mystics, and the Old Ones wherever they were. These dark beings were called the Enslavers, and their advent was the death toll of the Old Ones. For the Enslavers hit the Old Ones and their armies of lesser races hard, and between this new threat attacking them, where they thought that they were safe, in the realm of souls, and the onward rush of the Catan, they could not stand. And so they went down, and were destroyed utterly by their combined foes. And only one of them was said to survive the slaughter, only one out of their entire race. But we shall get to him anon. It was not the end for their races, their children, their weapons. Many survived the war in heaven. Now that the Old Ones were destroyed, the Necrons turned on their masters, the Catan, and with eons of planning and preparing, they struck them down, splitting them into myriads of shards, as they were too powerful to be outright destroyed with any weapon the Necrons had devised. But they were then forced into jails, stasis and tesseract vaults, and thus the Necrons had beaten their Catan masters. But the toll was so high, the carnage so astonishing, that they did not have the power to then defeat those races that were the children of the Old Ones. And thus the Necrons went into a slumber. They wished to hide in the timeless vaults of stasis for millions of years, to simply outwait the Eldari, Jukero and Krork. For they knew that the races would not stand the test of time. And they were right. But why this entire history lesson, when the banner states that we are here to discuss the soul and Psykers? Well, from my perspective, it is impossible to understand the present set of circumstances, the reason why the life of a Psyker is so horrific, their destiny so twisted, without this context. For in the war, in the battle at the beginning of time, the Immaterium was befouled. It was twisted from being the clear waters and wonderful potential of heaven into the hell that is today the warp. Poetic, no? Again, be careful what you wish for the Old Ones wished to defeat the Catan, and in so doing they destroyed everything they strove to protect. For in their attempt to stop the Catan, the demons of the Materium, the Old Ones inadvertently sowed the seeds of the creation of the dark gods of chaos, the demons of the Immaterium, of the warp. And it is this, the tale of Paradise Lost, that is so recurrent in the entire setting, a trope, a cycle that returns again and again. It reflects the broken heart of the grim darkness of the far future that entrances us all so much. But now that we have the past set in our minds, let us start to get to the point of this entry. Let us now discuss the soul, the warp, and those who can command them. Psykers. It is at this juncture I would ask that if you have not seen my entry on the warp and demons, you may want to view that for greater context. Another useful entry is my recent one on mutants, but I shall endeavour to try to make this as self-contained an entry by covering these things in brief. People often forget that the Warhammer universe is one of gothic horror, a cautionary tale against authoritarianism mixed with more than a smattering of candle-dripping gothic iconography and Lovecraftian terror. In the Warhammer universe, most sentient beings do have a soul. There are spirits, there are demons, and there is an afterlife. But alas, that afterlife has been corrupted. The gates of heaven thrown wide by the Old Ones and the serpent allowed in. For the soul is how the Psyker is aware of the Immaterium, that which has been twisted by the history of the galaxy into the hell that is the warp. And it is the soul that powers the very abilities that the mutants known as Psykers funnel and channel and form into the powers they display. When a soul is attached to a physical body is unknown, be it on conception, its first thoughts, or its first feelings, its first emotions, but they do exist. and it is this that makes them portals, makes them stand between one world and the other. For a soul is the key to existence in both realms, as it is the spiritual shadow in the warp of the material being in the materium. Most sentients have one, as we have seen, but in the Warhammer universe they are certainly not all created equal. Many are weak things that are such a small light that they are not and never will be the first choice, if noticed at all, by the dark denizens of the warp. Some races have far more power in their souls than others, the Eldari and humanity being the most well endowed of the major races. But the Orcs, the Jukero, and a myriad of other less numerous races are either suspected or outright known to have potent souls. But even this is not always enough. For many in the human race, despite having a soul, theirs is not strong enough, not connected enough to the warp for them to exhibit psychic powers. That ability to not only see the warp, to feel it, but to then command it and draw it into the realm of the materium. Mutants are genetic variants of the baseline, and in the human race there are many forms. The most feared and most powerful, yet ironically the most important in the setting until the very survival of the Imperium, are the Psykers. For they can manipulate the warp. They can draw it into the materium, and by its application they can perform wonders. Like wizards, sorcerers and scholars of any fantastical setting, they can bend and break the rules of the universe and play with the very building blocks of reality to attain any effect their hearts and minds may desire. No two psychers are identical in their power and propensities towards certain known effects and pathways of knowledge of the warp, for each sentient psyker will also have things that they excel at and things that are simply impossible to them, or so they perceive. Now many will say that the power of a psyker is more a gift with specific realizations, the ability to call and control the very airs and to unleash violent storms at a whim, how to read the thoughts of others and then potentially manipulate them, to bend others to their will like a martinet. The list of potential and documented abilities displayed by Psykers is almost limitless, as it is defined and only truly constrained by the imagination of the Psyker and the blocks and controls he puts on himself, consciously or subconsciously. The reality is that nothing is actually beyond the Psyker, as they use the power of the Immaterium to alter the Materium, and it is only their lack of interest, willpower or patience that prevents them from being omnipotent. And of course, there is the strength of their soul matched to the variable of the strength of their ability to control and manipulate the Immaterium. So, to the Psyker, there is a whole universe of power to be explored and controlled, harnessed and deployed. But the Immaterium is not a realm one would want to be in contact with at all. For when a Psyker develops powers, their soul becomes brighter. Their light shines into the warp as a beacon. But this can attract things best left alone. Now we discuss the warp. If you have seen my previous entry on this subject, you will be aware of the analogy of the warp as a river of souls, a borderless expanse where only thought and feelings exist. The warp is not like the Immaterium, as it has no defined rules. It is so far beyond categorization or explanation that it is almost ridiculous to try. Often have I seen people attempt to apply logical cause and effect, but this is a pointless venture. For by its very nature it is without form and thus without understanding. It is how it is meant to be. For one example, let us take time. There is no linear time in the warp, no trail of actions that then lead to the next. Confusing, eh? It means that you could have a conversation with someone that is gone, or could witness things that have not yet occurred in the Materium, and thus one can foresee the future. For all times appear at the same time within the warp, but it is also timeless in a very strange way. For to those in the material world, the date of the ascension of Slaanesh can be linked to not just a period, but given a definite time, a day, an hour, a set time in the course of history, a time before and a time after. Not so in the warp. Like children who have no object permanency. So when you take the toy they have gummed, they do not think it is gone and in your hand, or moved to somewhere else. It literally ceases to exist for them. They have no memory of it. And thus it is with the denizens of the warp, for there is no consecutive time. So in the case of Slaanesh, although we know there was a time before her existence, for the beings of the warp, she who thirsts exists, and always has. So if something were to ever destroy her, or any of the other greater or lesser beings of the warp, as soon as they are destroyed, however that might be achieved, then to all extents and purposes, they will never have existed. One could not have a discourse with a chaos god and threaten it with unmaking, with the example of another that you have already done this to, as it would simply not know of the missing god's existence, and no efforts to explain, no evidence or history would make them understand. Because they do not exist, they never did. And yet, the dark gods can plan and can scheme and can project their actions in a way that mimic prescience and awareness of time. Hence what they call the ongoing war between the forces of darkness, the great gods, what they call the great game, when each tries eternally to gain power over the others. One must simply understand that the warp and all of its goings-on will never be fully relatable, as they are so alien, and that is how it should remain. So for your sanity, just nod and shrug your shoulders and say warp stuff, as so many of us do. Some might say that this is a perfect excuse for whatever deus ex machina a writer may require, but I like to think of it as a realm that can never be defined, that lends to story without bounds, narrative that can explore nearly any and all topics of our Warhammer and the strange and potent realm. But how can we understand it better without trying to explain the inexplicable? As is my usual fallback, let us use imagery. Let us dream together. I would now like to build on the imagery and explanation I deployed previously, as I would like to get a teeny bit closer this time round, to give a better knowledge of the horror and tragedy that is contained therein. Possibly the greatest tragedy in all this grimdark setting, that this realm has been so besmirched. For we literally discuss the corruption of eternity, of heaven, its twisting into the pits of hell. Now think of the river of souls, the astral, the warp, as not being water, but liquid glass, but one that acts as a mirror. And in that mirror is reflected all of the emotions, all of the feelings and thoughts of all that have ever existed. A feeling, an emotion, is reflected as a light and colour. A thought would have far more substance, and would be an image unto itself. So when one looked into the warp, one might see torrents of colours passing by, in every imaginable hue. But then one would also see a dazzling and dizzying profusion of images, memories, thoughts, scenarios that will never be forgot. Ideas and things that were never realized, but their creator yet molded the warp just with their mind's eye. Now, as the warp has flowed, those colors have coalesced. For example, red as rage. Now there has been so much rage in the universe, so much killing and hate, that there are huge swathes of the warp that are now colored purely red, and become more so every second. With every las gunshot, every bayonet impaled, every bolter exploding, every act of hatred, it grows stronger. This force has been so much that it has now formed into a being, drawing all of the red color to itself until it finally gained consciousness and became a god. Khorne. Its only drive, its only modus operandi, its only goal is to create more of itself, more hatred and war and anger and slaughter, for that is all that it is, that is all it understands, and all it craves. Hence can it never truly be reasoned with, as unlike any other biological sentient being, it only has one drive, to make the entire warp, the whole of the Sea of Souls, one color, one hue, its own, and it will never stop until it has reached this impossible goal. And so it is with all of the forces of chaos, the dark gods. They wish all to be as they. Compared to this, the great game, the crusade to dominate all, there really is little of interest in the materium, in the real world. Oh, there are many who view the dark gods as slavering beasts simply looking for that one door left ajar, so they can burst into the materium and cause carnage. This is also true, though. I will explain. The entities that are the dark gods have such control of themselves, such power, that they are difficult to understand from a mortal perspective. But here goes. Imagine that the being Khorne is made up of as many cells as we are, numbering in the millions or more. Now imagine that any one of those cells can be broken off at his whim and given instructions to perform a task. Now the cell will always retain its membership of the whole, of the being of Khorne, so will always act in his interests, as they are still one. Hence are minor demons created. These are autonomous in seeming, but always act to further the goals of their god. So although Khorne himself is far less interested in the materium, having his great game, his great war to wage against his brothers, he does have demons that are, as described, waiting, constantly thirsting. Now these lesser demons, despite even being princes, are like a hungry id, a being of pure impulse that sits in a darkened room and starves, because Khorne has formed this being to do just that, to starve until it gets in. When a psyker uses the warp, they then appear as a bright light to the demon, a screen into a world they would very much like to visit. So one can almost picture the demon slavering as it puts its eye to a tiny chink in a wall, and on the other side are all the things it wishes to dine on most. And it is the psyker that is both lighthouse and doorway to the diabolic being. Only through the use of the psyker can they gain access to the world. Only through the psyker's power can they breach the barrier, and then only through the psyker's power, its very soul, can they take form, or possess his or hers, to wear them as a space marine would use a power armor. For the beings of the warp cannot be sustained in the real world unless they have an abundant source of energy to sustain them. And this is either souls in great quantity, or the power of the psyker to bring the energies of its natural realm across the boundary to sustain it. Simply put, the dream will dissipate in the light of dawn if it is not supported and kept alive by the dreamer. So it is that each and every psyker is the Trojan horse that could allow a being of evil into reality. And by doing so, these beings can then use their knowledge, perform unspeakable acts, and gain the supplication from others that will equate to the power necessary to throw open the gates between matter and spirit, reality and the warp, and then all of the legions of hell pour forth. So it can be seen that every single psyker is a danger. Each and every one is a chaos invasion in the making. Every one can fall to the power of chaos and inflict such damage on the world that their existence at all must be hard weighed. Now, gentle listener, I feel we have covered the background, the basics. We have set the stage for us to progress in the future, for this is a large topic, and I would give it the attention it is due. On our journey, we shall discuss the many forms of psychers that exist in each of the factions, the relevant differences between the souls of the major races, and go on to discuss the nature of the different kinds of gods, why I see the Eldari pantheon and Gorka Mork as utterly different to the Chaos gods. We shall go on to see what other beings and entities dwell in the warp, and how its use is so important to not only the Imperium and humanity, but near every race in the Warhammer universe. I shall explain how I believe the Eldar are the greatest traitors, the most wayward sons, for what I suspect is their ultimate betrayal of the Old Ones. And I shall go on to reveal why I think the last of the Old Ones, Ka, acted as cultivator one last time, and how the human soul is the most potent of all. I hope you will join me on this sojourn into the Warhammer universe, and would urge you to subscribe and hit that notifications button so you do not miss out. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope to see you again soon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make time for fun. Toodaloo.